好吧，我可能是电脑出了问题。我刚才还想说一下王开元的电脑有问题，我这个电脑也出了问题。好吧，那就这样吧。
那我们
对啊，就这样吧，不耽误时间了。这些照片呢，以后你要追书的时候，我提供给你，有很多照片啊。另外呢，最后我要感谢一下开源学沙龙，感谢亚伟，同时呢，在这儿已经见到了很多很多的朋友，包括陆国斌啊，那个那个那个，除了这个我怎么？
不是卓啊，
对对，还有我还见到了南希。我今天本来想展示一张我画的画，这是开源要求我画的，
对，
谢谢大家，谢谢大家，
是傅老
我
师的画像。
就讲到这儿。好，
好的，好的，那个感谢周志新周总啊，这个周总多才多艺，刚才最后展现了一张他画的傅高义老师的像。下面呢，我们就要有请我们非常尊敬的傅高义老师的夫人
好，我的摄影
Professor Eicos 给我们致辞。
要还给他，
谢谢。
已经给他了是吧？
志新，你把你的 mute 掉，把你的声音 mute 掉。OK，please， Professor Eicos, please.
Yes, I thought I would just say a few words because it would be hard to say something original given what everybody has already said. So I thought I would just share with you two experiences with Ezra. Like many of you, I was the beneficiary of his very helpful and generous attitude towards young scholars. I first met Ezra back in 1973 in Hong Kong at the University Service Center. At the time, I was a graduate student from the University of Hawaii, and I was on my first research trip to see whether or not Hong Kong would be an appropriate place for me as an anthropologist to study aging. My tentative topic was aging in Hong Kong. One day I saw that Ezra had posted a notice on the bulletin board at the University Service Center offering to discuss their research with any young scholar who was interested in talking with him. So I signed up. We discussed my topic. He thought it was interesting, but he thought it would be a problem for me to do it in Hong Kong because, as he is a great advocate for speaking the language of the people you're interviewing, I would have to learn Cantonese. He suggested that instead I go to Taiwan, where I would be able to work in Mandarin. Okay, fortunately, I had the opportunity that summer to go and spend a week in Taiwan and to kind of check out the situation as a potential research site. And it wasn't a good one. Nobody in Taiwan at that time, this was 1973, was especially interested in the topic of older people and their experiences. Hong Kong, however, was. So I think Ezra was rather impressed that I took his advice, that is to say, I did go and check things out in Taiwan, but then I didn't follow it. I decided I would go, and yes, I had to learn Cantonese. Another interesting topic was that he is a very humane person and a very humble person. One of the interesting stories that I hadn't really remarked on, but a few weeks ago, well, a few days ago, actually, I was speaking with my nephew who grew up with my parents. And one day, almost 30 years ago, Ezra and I were at my parents' for dinner. And when the dinner was done, my mother got up to wash the dishes. But instead, Ezra jumped up and insisted that she sit down. He would do the dishes. And he did. My nephew was very impressed that such a famous person would nevertheless do the dishes. I was a little less surprised because, in fact, doing the dinner dishes is his job. He always does the dinner dishes. He cooks breakfast, I do the breakfast dishes. He cooks dinner, I cook dinner, he does the dinner dishes. So Ezra has always been a very modest and humble man. He did not act like a big shot. And as Deborah Davis said at the very beginning of this talk, he could learn from anybody. In fact, he liked to quote a man he much admired named Raleigh Walker, who was sort of the sage of his hometown, Delaware, Ohio. This man, who I think was also his Bible studies teacher, liked to say of a person, he's so smart, he can learn from anyone. And I think that captures Ezra.
Wow.
That's it.
非常感动，非常感谢啊！这个我今天才第一次知道，原来傅大教授在家也洗盘子啊！哇，真是了不起！好，我想许多观众们可能也是等了很久了，因为热爱傅老师的不仅是我们这10几位嘉宾，热爱他的人成千上万。今天虽然我们中断了几次，但是我刚才看还是又有200多人上了线。这个观众们会有很多问题，下面我们请中美印象网主编刘亚伟博士来主持这个观众提问环节。谢谢亚伟兄。
开源，你把这个PowerPoint 关了吧，这个
好的，
这样 we can see everyone。
OK。
谢谢开源，这个从开始到现在已经3个小时了，这个我们是这个听众的提了一些问题。So the first question actually goes to Charlotte. So Charlotte, the question goes like this: how did Ezra balance intimate association with players or makers of history and intellectual detachment? I applaud Ezra's practices, and I wish to know more about the relationship.
I'm sorry, I don't quite understand the question.
So he knows a lot of people that are history makers, but at the same time, he had to be detached enough to write about history and to assess history. So how is he managing this relationship that he knows a lot of these people who are history makers, but at the same time to maintain his objectivity as a scholar?
I'm sorry to say you'd have to ask him that question. I really don't know. All I know is I think he was very successful at it, but I don't really know his specific technique. Sorry.
Thanks, Charlotte. The second question, I think Bob is still around. I know Bob answered that question at the Q&A, but I wonder if you would like to answer that question to everyone. So Bob, what would be the challenge for Professor Vogel to share his views on China in today's academic environment?
So, of course, Ezra was very disappointed at the trend over the last 4 years in U.S.-China relations, but he was quite strong in advocating for strengthening cooperation and to reversing the trend. We mentioned earlier his activities with Chinese scholars in open letter, his efforts to prepare a memo for the next administration, his participation in dialogues. They're all dedicated to trying to recover the relationship and moving forward. In the spirit of this discussion of Ezra and his commitment to understanding and people-to-people relations and his colleagues, I refer you to perhaps his final op-ed he wrote for the Washington Post. And what he was most concerned about in that op-ed was the direction of US policy toward China was hurting the people in China that Americans cared most about, our friends and our colleagues. And he thought this was so detrimental to our long-term cooperation understanding and the ability to develop a better relationship. He advocated improving relations so that we could improve cooperation with our friends and colleagues. And this always was a foundation for Ezra's belief in understanding and how to move the relationship forward. The commitment to the relationship was as strong as ever, however much as many have observed how worried he was about the relationship.
All right, the next question, 下一个问题应该是问这个盛平先生的。你刚才讲到这个傅教授的这个胡耀邦传，这个6月30号，傅教授参加我们组织的这个中美关系青年学者论坛，我当时也问到过，说这本书的进展如何，他当时没有回答得很具体，所以不知道据你的了解，也可能这个宋教授也可能参与回答这个问题，就是说胡耀邦传是不是已经开写了？如果开写了，写到什么地步？有你们能回答这个问题？如果是 不方便回答也没关系嘛。那个盛老师，你先说一下。
郑平兄可能掉线了。
掉线了。那凤教授 ，Michael，can you say a few words about the progress of the book？
说老实话，我实际上正在写个 email 给 Charlotte， 就是要讨论这个问题。如果我们在中国的话，很简单，我们就叫一个学生把书写完，这个就国内的传统。恐怕美国的传统也不一定这样子，而且不见得有能得到傅高义的这个学术水准的学生。So I don't have an answer. I think it's an important work and that it's important to many people. I think his students and his friends will have to get together and talk about what might come of his many unfinished projects. I mean, it's extraordinary that Ezra was as Bob and others have mentioned, and Charlotte has mentioned, had at least 5 projects going on. As he went into the hospital. And I think one of the reasons this has been so difficult for us is that he fully expected and we fully expected that these projects would continue. So in due time, I think all of us who worked with him and who loved him and would like to see his legacy continued, we will get together and see which of those projects we can help push forward.
Thank you. Charlotte, would you like to make a comment on what Michael just said?
I am sorry to say that I don't think he has written a draft at all. I don't know what they will work with. I mean, he has wonderful interviews, of course, because people were very, very helpful to him. But I don't think that he had begun to write.
Okay, thanks. 刚才我们听众给甘琪社长提了很多问题，但是大部分问题呢我们在 chat 里边回答了。但是甘琪，你刚才说到这个傅教授的这个《中国与日本1500年》，说是出版的时间可能是这个习近平访问日本的时间，但是习近平什么时候访问日本我们根本不知道，所以是不是非要等到他访问那天这本书才能出，还是说书只要好了就可以出，还是说为了能出这本书必须要借政治的东风才可以？
没有，这是 Ezra 在最早开始谈这件事的时候他的一个心愿。我想因为大家都比较了解他的工作的风格，他其实是特别希望这个人们理解的基础好，在这个之上才能够帮助政治的转变。所以呢，他原来有这个心愿是因为习近平去年4月就要访日，有这样的计划。那么现在当然这一切都不重要了，但是因为世界变化太快了，所以您的问题的结论就是什么时候能出来，什么时候就出来，应该这样讲。
那现在是什么？是翻译没有完全做好，还是说已经进入
这个都做好了，但是那个现在是就是申报和通过的一个过程。这个过程呢，因为各种的那个就是疫情啊，各种变化，这是我们都是无法了解的。
那你就说
目前还无法预期。
申报就是说在大陆版。
对，因为香港版我们自己出了就好了，所以很高兴他看到了，而且也参加了发布会，所以这个是很好的一件事情。现在我们就等待吧。
OK， 下一个问题是给高原先生的，这个我不知道高原有没有在 chat 里边看，那有很长的这个一个问题，这个加了很多的这个说明。那意思就是说，这个傅教授是为了这个写这本书，还有他做的很多事儿，都是希望中日能够友好。问题呢是说， 这个中国和日本能不能这个在这个历史问题上，最后能够有一个比较圆满的结果，这个双方能够这个和平相处，这个把亚洲把世界变得更好、更繁荣、更和平。
那个为了充分回答这个人的问题呢，我觉得我需要比较长的时间，用比较长的文章来充分的回答但是我想说一点，就是为了民族之间的和解呢，特别是经过战争的两个民族的和解，需要一个必要条件和一个十分条件。那个必要条件是加害者要衷心道歉，这是必要的条件。为了和解，但是这还不够吧？十分条件是什么呢？是受害者要接受那个道歉。在这个文脉上，我记得很清楚，2007年，那个时候的总理温家宝先生。来日本的时候，在日本国会，做一个演讲了。当时那个演讲讲话当中，他是这样说的：日本政府与领导人多次机会表示对历史问题的立场，承认日本表现深刻反省与道歉。对此，中国政府与人民表示高度评价。我听到这个演讲的时候非常感动，因为这是第一次，中国的领导人呢正面表示接受日本方面的道歉，这是很有勇气、很有勇敢的一个发言。这个演讲是那个时候在中国电视上也直播的一个这个场合。我非常感动，所以呢，我刚才讲的那样子，在日本方面，我们要好好让孩子们学习战争的历史，在中国方面，非常希望好好那个中国的孩子们好好学习战后的历史，这就是傅高义教授希望的情况，谢谢。
So the rest of the questions all go to Professor 宋教授，两个很小的问题，然后两个稍微长一点的问题，之后我们就结束今天的这个线上圆桌会议。两个短的问题，一个是how to contact the team, the Vogel team. So maybe you can send something to the chat, basically your email or somebody else's email. The second quick question is, will Harvard University name any China or Japan, US-China, Japan-related building after Ezra Vogel? So that's the second short question. You want me to post the rest, or you want to give?
Let me answer those two. Let me answer those two very quickly.
Okay.
I'm not sure who asked. 这个问题是用英文问的，或者用中文问的吧？
用英文问的。
那我用英文回答。So I'm not sure who asked the question. I suspect it was not a colleague from America, because I think that you need to understand that there was no Ezra Vogel team. It's extraordinary, but all of this it looks like there was an Ezra Vogel team, but Ezra did all of this on his own, with the help of his, he hired research assistants, he hired language teachers. Nancy Hurst provided extraordinary support for Ezra, but there is no Ezra Vogel team as such. The questioner is welcome to contact me, and I can try to put them in touch with the specific person that they're looking for. But I do want to make this point that I know on the Chinese side, on the Japanese side, maybe you think there was this enormous 团队 of supporters. It's not. It was all Ezra. I think it is quite sure that we will find a way to memorialize Ezra in a permanent way. that actually won't be a decision made by the university. It'll be made by the people close to him. It's really too early to say what form that memorial will take, but the questioner should be assured. There are many great scholars at Harvard, and obviously not all of them can have buildings named after them, but Ezra was special, and we'll find some way. And actually, I should also add, Charlotte, we haven't talked about this, but my guess is Ezra probably wouldn't want a building named after him. He'd want a scholarship. He'd want, sorry, I shouldn't. We will talk about this later, but I think we will try to do it in a way that is true to Ezra.
Michael, I'm really struck by your comment that Ezra doesn't have a team. This reminded me of a book written by John Nesbitt called The 10 Megatrends in China, which obviously is a government effort. Ezra wrote all these books about China by himself. But that book, when people ask Nesbitt, you don't know the language. We talk about the language. How were you able to get to interview so many people in China? And he said, I had a huge team. And you know who assembled that huge team. So that I just cannot help to make that comparison. So the third question for Michael, again, asked in English. And I think Ezra mentioned in one of the articles in commemoration of article of Ezra said, Ezra told friends that Harvard existed even before Qing dynasty emerged. And so the question is the role of Harvard in educating Chinese students. Many of them returned to China, some of them stayed here. But in more recent time, Harvard was also offering sessions and fellowship to Chinese government officials. So the question is, what role does Harvard University play in the transformation of China, whether it's a significant role or less significant role? And also, of course, we know, the daughter of the current leader also studied at Harvard. During his meeting with the previous Harvard president, I think he said Harvard University, he's grateful to Harvard University because Harvard University's education has changed her outlook. So the floor is yours.
Well, he said that about 6 or 7 years ago, I believe, when President Faust visited.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm not sure if he would hold the same view now. I'm actually, if you don't mind, Yahweh, I'm not going to answer that question simply because our focus today is on Ezra.
Okay.
And it's an interesting question, and it's an important question. It's a question that we think about all the time, but I think it's not the question for tonight, especially as we draw to a close. What I will say is I think Ezra was very conscious of the special role of Harvard, he knew that being at Harvard gave him a special vantage point to talk to Chinese people and Chinese officials. We've heard so much about Ezra's generosity today, and I'll just give one other example of that generosity, which is whenever we received a delegation at the Fairbanks Center, they always wanted to see Fu Jiaoshou. And it didn't matter what the delegation was about. And I tried to limit the number of times I bothered Ezra, but Ezra said to me, he was happy to do it, happy to meet with these delegations and take a photograph with these delegations if it was important for the Fairbanks Center and if it was important for US-China relations. So the one thing I will say is I think Ezra was very conscious of Hafo, Hadai, the special reputation that we have in Asia. As Gaoqin mentioned, he did not use that to enrich himself. If anything, he used it to enrich Ohio Wesleyan. He used it because, and here I come back to something Bob said, he recognized that scholarship could serve a higher purpose. This is one more lesson that we at Harvard, but everyone can learn from Ezra.
Right. The last question, I think, is very relevant to today's memorial discussion. And that question is, basically, it was filed in Chinese. It says, Ezra is a sociologist. He's a political scientist. He's a historian. As a scholar, when he does research and when he writes books, he always, takes a global view and is able to abandon a kind of nationalistic, narrow mindedness. And so the question is, what, as scholars, do we learn from Ezra? And, what are the peculiar characteristics that are the most important as far as Ezra's scholarship is concerned?
So, it's a funny thing that nobody can answer that question.
I can answer it.
Charlotte, can you answer that question?
I can answer that question. He, believe it or not, studied under Talcott Parsons, and Parsons had a scheme for analyzing society into 4 quadrants. I did not study under Parsons, so I don't remember what those quadrants were. But, one was values, economics, family, and something else. And he would try to understand all 4 quadrants. So he really went, holistically. And he often said to me, I'm really glad I had Talcott Parsons, because that scheme, which I think is no longer so popular, really gave him insight.
So I'm gonna stick with my initial position. It's rude of me to disagree with you, Charlotte, but what I had in mind was that there's nobody who was comfortable working in so many disciplines as Ezra. And so one thing that struck me is when I read his history, I would sometimes get a glimpse of Ezra the sociologist. And when Ezra wrote on contemporary U.S.-China relations, you could sometimes get a glimpse of Ezra the historian. But he was, in many ways, really sui generis. 中文它就是独一无二的, because he was so expansive. The one thing, maybe I'll just add one other point, which is that Ezra in the world of Chinese studies was quite unfashionable, because I think of what Charlotte was just talking about, this idea of understanding another society holistically. The tendency in the academe is to carve China or Japan up into the anthropological perspective and the sociological perspective and the political science perspective. And Ezra fought that tendency and was an inspiration to those of us who agree with that approach. He will I hope, because I am currently director of an interdisciplinary center, that's one more way in which I hope the spirit of Ezra can be maintained.
谢谢你，宋教授. So that's the end of 问答就到这里. So I just want to end my Q&A session by, I read Song Jiao Shou's article, and you said, live to the 90s, in the Chinese tradition. That's a very happy thing, even though we're all very saddened by the fact, but we also want to celebrate. Another scholar wrote that Ezra's passing away is the end of an era. So that triggered me to look at, when Ezra was born in 1930. So the next year, the two countries that he's most interested, that, he loves Japan, he's interested in China, went to war in 1931. So in 1953, he was at Harvard. At that time, US and China just ended the confrontation in Korea. Now in 1963, he went to Hong Kong and he was involved in setting up the China Resource Center, which right now is one of the most controversial issue, involving Chinese University of Hong Kong. And in 1973, I think that's when Charlotte and Ezra met. He traveled to China for the first time. Starting from 1980, he was in China multiple times every year. And in 1998, he hosted Jiang Zemin at the Fairbanks Center. I think that was a moment when the relationship was finally repaired after what happened in 1989. And finally, January, a year ago, he was in China with the Public Intellectuals Program. Nobody would have known at that time this was his last visit to China. And this was also the year that really has changed the world. So what I want to say is, the era Ezra Vogel has lived actually is still here. And by looking at what happened in Washington, D.C. on Wednesday, it's a clear reminder, the world could be the same today as when Ezra was born in 1930, when nationalism, when militarism, when all these ugly and evil social political trends are, all over the world, and today is the case. So remembering him is a good way to think forward and also to look at how important our responsibility is. We learn from Ezra and we want to make this world more peaceful, and together we can make a difference. So Kai Yuan, now I turn over to you.
我有一个1分钟的这个中文的结语，然后呢，这个英文的结语还是请亚伟老师啊。民意测验表明啊，现在中日美3国之间的好感呢是在下降，不满呢却在上升。那么今天呢，3国的学者在这里一同纪念傅高义先生，说明傅先生一定有他的伟大之处。刚才许多的学者都已经谈出他们心中傅先生的伟大之处。那今天呢，我在这里也讲讲我心目当中傅先生的伟大之处。我觉得傅先生啊，终其一生啊，不懈不怠，以赤子之心投入真情，挖掘真相，探求真知，传播拙见，推动中日美3个国家和人民之间的相互理解，促进和平，为这个世界留下了宝贵的遗产。他待人是那样的平易，那样的虚怀若谷，那样的纯真，他真的是我们的好榜样。不仅是为学，也是为人，而且他最关键的是把为学和为人做了最好的统一。他超越了人间的藩篱，他真正是在为文明的进步做贡献。我相信先生就会像天上的星星一样，一直在看着我们，看着我们继承他的衣钵，做一个真正的学者，做一个真正的人。先生不朽，谢谢。亚伟兄
So that
英文的closing words，请你。
Yeah, that brings us to the end of here. I want to end by asking the same question that Professor Wu Xinbo from Harvard University asked. That is, there are so many China scholars, in the US and in other countries. Why Ezra Vogel's passing away has created such a phenomenon in China is that, everyone not only were they shocked, they're saddened, and they're just pouring out all these memories and articles, about him. I think it's incumbent upon us to look at Ezra not just as a person, not just as a scholar, but as someone who has really, his scholarship, his generosity, his kindness, his fairness, his spirit has lifted all of us up to go beyond narrow nationalist arguments and resentment, and to all go after this mutual understanding. I think we really need to do more to analyze Ezra as a phenomenon, and this is a good positive phenomenon that not just the scholar community, but also the policy decision-making community need to learn from Ezra, and that is the importance of empathy. Without that, I think the world will be a very dangerous place. And Kaya, you want to talk about the book project or no?
I think we can discuss it later. Okay.
All right. So I want to say good evening to everyone here in the US. It's already almost midnight. And good afternoon to everyone in China. I think it's long, but it's worthwhile. We all have learned a lot. And again, I think responsibility is upon us to dissect Ezra and to get Ezra, as a spiritual monument for all scholars, policymakers, just ordinary people. I think if we all can be like him, this is a much better, more gentler and kinder world. Thank you all. 谢谢大家。
谢谢嘉宾，谢谢听众，也谢谢后台的各位志愿者，感谢大家。